It's the final word. Adam Collins and Jeff Lemon back for a weekly show after a couple that we've taken off due to the T20 World Cup, which has been run and won. We will talk about Australia's victory in a little bit, although not too much. We did that on The Daily Show, Jeff, back on Sunday. Thanks to everybody who listened and watched those over the course of the last 2 or 3 weeks. We have Taha Hashim and Nikesh Rughani joining us today for a long conversation about the Azeem Rafiq saga, but an awful lot more too about institutional racism in cricket in this country and beyond. We have a bit to talk about around what we're doing with our live shows, Jeff, which I can announce off the top today. But before doing any of that, hello, Jeff, and look what I've got. I'm going to say down the Zoom screen. I can show you this before we started. I'll put it to the camera as well because we are on YouTube. Check this out. This is the Brazil playing kit. We have been both sent kindly by Matt and by Roberta the playing shirt and the cap of the Brazil women's national team, which I will wear proudly. So I'm going to pack one of those, or a shirt and a hat, in my suitcase to bring back to you, Jeff, when I depart for Australia in 3 days. Hello.
Well, pack 2 of them, I hope, because then we can wear them together.
Yes.
And fully realise our destiny to be as embarrassing as possible. If Winnie were a bit older, we could do it with her in public. Just to
she's got that, hasn't she? We received for her. A baby Bangladesh top. Not a baby Bangladesh top,
the smallest possible.
Yeah, sent through a small top Bangladesh for her. So we can all wear green together at some point, but Brazil for you and me.
Brian Withington was very, very sharp with that purchase. It was an investment in the future.
And a good one at that. I see that Brazil are one of many countries who have been awarded global tournaments in the last 24 hours or so. Jeff, let's start there. We have seen the entire ICC men's calendar from 2024 to 2031 announced. And if you fold in the 2023 Men's World Cup next year, that means India cash into the tune of 4 tournaments in 8 years and 5 in 10 if you count the World T20 they've just hosted, albeit in the UAE. They've done very well, but the main news story, I suppose, was that the United States of America, alongside the West Indies, are hosting the Men's T20 World Cup in 2024.
5 in 10 years. Yep, they definitely needed that. India. It's all about the co-hosts, because that's how the ICC have made it look like this is a bit more democratic. Oh, West Indies and the USA. There'll be 3 games probably in Fort Lauderdale or whatever it's called. The 2026 T20 competition will be India and Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka will get like 3 games in Gaul or something. Bangladesh get a co-hosting gig, couple of games in Dhaka. It's a bit of a whitewash, this, isn't it? The only real change from the England, Australia, India get all the tournaments is that South Africa will get the major 50-over World Cup in 2027, to be shared with Namibia and Zimbabwe. But yeah, the rest of it's just been a little bit cheekily spread around. 2030, it'll be England and Ireland and Scotland. Yeah, I'm sure there'll be heaps of games in Dublin. I mean, they're predictable, aren't they? And they've junked off the one-day Super League that meant that some of the bigger teams had to play some of the smaller teams because, we don't really need that anymore. We tried that for a couple of years, no good.
Yeah, this was slipped in there. So, I mean, obviously we celebrate the fact that the World Cup returns to 14 teams in 2027. No concerns with that, but that's the justification to get rid of the 13-team Super League. And yes, it is true to say the Super League did underpin the qualifying schedule for a 10-team World Cup. That is accurate. No questions there. However, it also gave men's one-day cricket some structure in the way that women's one-day cricket has had some structure over the last 6 years. And it also meant that, frankly, they had no choice but to play teams they wouldn't otherwise play. The very fact that England have to go and play 3 one-day internationals in Holland next year, for instance. There are many examples like that of series that would have never have gone ahead and can only be helpful to nations who made the 13 but aren't getting loads of opportunities against the bigger nations. Holland's a good example this time, but the level below it that had the USA in it, for example, able to play consistent one-day international cricket for the first time. Presumably that entire structure gets junked in favour of the top 10 teams qualifying and the next 4 having a qualifying tournament. In other words, basically what we're getting with the men's T20 at the moment. So they'll get 2 weeks of concentrated cricket in a qualifier, but that's nothing compared to 4 years or 3 years at the very least of round-robin cricket, when they might get a chance to play away in India or home in Australia or against Australia or whatever it is, countries that usually would ignore them.
Yeah, that's the fundamentals. But the larger teams don't want to play those other teams. So this is a handy way of not doing that. You can't say they're not consistent, the ICC. If anything, they're not consistent. Every second World Cup will be in India. There'll be 250 over World Cups in the space of 8 years in India, 2023 and 2031. I mean, why not? Go where the money is. Get it in a big pile, and then you can all roll in the pile, and then you get the smell of money all over you, and then you can go rub up against other people because you smell of money and be like, yeah, waft it, give it a whiff.
Yeah, it's an aphrodisiac, I suppose. But yeah, remember, the ICC are always, those who work for the ICC are always quick to remind us that they are a member-based organisation. They work for the members, and sure enough, this was a recommendation from the Chief Executives Committee, I think it was, which has 12 CEOs on there from the full member nations, who really boils down to what's the will of the room and what's the will of India, and occasionally the will of India, Australia and England, depending on how they're feeling at the time. So yes, 4 of the tournaments in the next 8 years from 2023 will be in India. Surprise, surprise. Jeff, I said we've got live shows to announce. Let's get straight to that. We have been busy behind the scenes, and we have locked in Melbourne on the 13th of December at the Mission to Seafarers, where we were in 2019. We have locked on the 14th of December, the Uni Bar in Adelaide for our second Adelaide live show. We did one of those 2 years ago as well. And we haven't quite locked in, but we've nearly locked in Sydney on the 4th of January. So we're not going to start selling tickets to that as yet. But in the show notes, you will see 2 different links for 2 different shows, as is the custom. The Melbourne on the 13th of December, and we jump on the plane on the 14th, and we'll arrive in Adelaide for that show the following evening. And, they've all been sellouts so far. I expect this will be as well. Can't wait to have you all along. Can't wait to get you to the Seafarers.
I can't wait to have people being allowed to be in the same room, because apparently that will happen in Melbourne before the time of the show. We're relying on that happening. Obviously, if something goes desperately awry, then we'll work out ways to give everyone their cash back. But it should happen, and there'll be us in a room where seafarers are normally in the room. There'll be a big ship's bell that we may or may not ring. And there will be good times had. We're working out what the show exactly is going to look like. A hot tip for you, if you're listening, if you haven't joined the Patreon, now's a good time, because you get a discount on your tickets. So why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you? It's the best time. Now's the best time.
Yeah,
join up. You can probably win a slab, and you can get a discount on your tickets.
That's right. And speaking of slabs, Bricklaying are going to be very much part of what we're doing in these live shows. But yeah, it's like when we had our virtual live shows during lockdown with Damien Fleming and Stuart McGill. We are offering a third discount to our patrons, so that'll all be specified in the ticket link and in the show notes. But yeah, if you're not a patron already and you get on board now, you'll have access to that code, and away we go. And if you're not, that's cool too. We'd love to have you. I think the last time, and in fact, the first time I went to the Seafarers, Jeff, you were performing there. This was in 2014. You were doing some spoken word presentations that night, and I remember it fondly. So there's the early days of when you and I would see each other in the pub before we were working with each other. And then in 2019, it was like our homecoming show, wasn't it? After the 19 World Cup and Ashes, we went there before the Test series between Australia and Pakistan, if memory serves me correctly. Brad Hodge was with us that night. We did the Ballad of Sean Marsh that night in full. And then in Adelaide 2019, the following week, we did Jim Maxwell telling filthy stories. We did Jason Gillespie telling his tale of life in cricket. and that was an absolute beauty as well at the Ambassadors. But we are going to go to it's called Unibar. It's on the banks of the River Torrens across the road from Adelaide Oval. So it's a nice test match location a couple of days before the test starts between Australia and England. So what we've tried to do is place both of these shows between the Brisbane test, which no one's going to anyway because we're locked out of Queensland. So that'll be the night after the Brisbane test finishes, and then 2 days before the Adelaide test match starts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I will be in Brisbane, but I can't do a live show on my own. But, if people just want to come down to the house that I'm doing home quarantine in and, I'll just do a show for you over the fence or something. Give me something to do while I'm locked up in there.
All right, so bring your mates, get involved, even if they're not necessarily part of what we've done on the Final Word before. Remember, Jeff, in London in 19 at the Hampstead Cricket Club show, we had a bunch of blokes who, I don't know, like a friend of a friend of a friend told them to come to this cricket show. There was about 10 of them. They had the time of their lives, and they've all been Final Word listeners thereafter. And I think a couple of them are now patrons too. So in keeping with that spirit, bring everybody along. I mentioned that Brick Lane will be there in force, both in Melbourne and Adelaide. We have some good news that may or may not have been revealed off the top of the show. I'm not sure if it was part of Jay's intro this week, but we are giving away at the moment 200 4-packs of Brick Lane for free. And all you need to do, Jeff, is simply sign up to the Brick Lane mailing list, and you do that by going to bricklanebrewing.com/pages/the final word. That'll be in the show notes as well. So click that link, put your details in, get yourself on the mailing list, and if you're of the first 200 people to do that, there's a 4-pack coming your way.
And, they're nice people. They won't send you a million emails a day. I trust they're not the kind of list that would over-email, because they're decent. They're from Melbourne. They're from Dandenong, out Adams Way. They're earthy. They're local. They use local produce. They employ local people. They try to look after the environment with what they do. They're an all-round good news brewery. And if you don't like drinking, you can drink their options that don't have any booze in them.
And what we're also going to do with Brick Lane while we're on the topic of live shows, we haven't quite got this down pat yet, but one night during the Melbourne Test match, we will work with Brick Lane to do, hopefully, the daily show from there. I wouldn't say to a studio audience necessarily, but you can come along and hang out with Jeff and me as we record it at Brick Lane, at Queen Victoria Market, and then we can all have a couple of beers and a bite to eat afterwards in there. So provided that all lines up with the schedule, we'll be endeavouring to do that. Probably not Boxing Day, but one of the days that follow, 27, 28, 29, something like that. So bricklanebrewing.com/pages/the final word to get yourself in the first 200. And there'll also be a 15% offer, Jeff, that we are rolling out again. We have Maxi 145 and loads of people got involved in that. That's going to be our December, let's call it Christmas offer. We haven't quite worked out what the code's going to be, but watch this space. We'll reveal all on the weekly show, hopefully, next week.
Well, since we're coming into an Ashes, I think it should be Sean Marsh 182. Can we do 18.2%? Can we? Let's see if we can negotiate Brick Lane up to 18.2.
I reckon that's quite. Is 182 what he made at Adelaide
in Hobart?
Last time, was it? Oh, at Hobart. Sorry.
Yeah.
Because we could. Go
I suppose
with
we
what
could do
he
his
made at
Ashes. That was 126, I think. So that's not as generous.
Yeah.
I think it's the ultimate Sean Marsh day was the 182.
Okay, well, let's commit to that. By that, I mean, let's ask Brick Lane permission, but they're usually very, very good about this. Good people doing good things. Speaking of the Ashes, Jeff, now the World Cup's over, we can focus on the real stuff. Said with tongue-in-cheek. The Ashes squad of 15 has been announced. Very different to how it was done, I suppose it was 11 years ago when they had that process of elimination when they named like 19 and evicted one person off the island each day.
Someone got pushed into the pool.
Yes, the Rob Guest was pushing people into the man-o-man pool, and they ended up with a squad of, I think, 14 for the first two tests there. Well, it's 15 this time. I'm still not entirely sure why they bother with these squads of 15 in the modern era. I mean, of course, if they want to pick someone up who's not in there, they'll fly them into the team. But anyway, it's a bit of a relic, but let's go with it. The first two test matches...
I guess because they have to quarantine to go to Brisbane, don't they? So whoever their players are, they have to be there for the 2 weeks of of quarantine, a week before they'll no longer have to do it anymore.
That is a very, very good point. I didn't even consider that. Yes, they will have to, because I'm not quarantining. I've kind of forgotten the fact that these players are being put into 2 weeks of completely unnecessary quarantine purely because CA is so bloody stubborn that they wouldn't have moved the Brisbane test to January when it obviously should be, to mean all the players coming home from the World Cup could spend 2 weeks with their families. But instead of letting players have 2 precious weeks with their families, let's lock them up in a hotel for 2 weeks back in Brisbane. What a good idea that is. Anyway, that's all been and done. For Australia, the news, well, at least I thought the news was no Nick Maddinson and no Mitchell Marsh. I thought, even though George Bailey was quite bullish around Marcus Harris playing the first test last week, in the back of my mind, I thought that was a bit of a bluff, and Maddo would have been like right there with him, given his extraordinary record for Victoria over the last couple of years, and it looked like Maddo was kind of cherry right to get another opportunity at test level. But Marcus Harris is going to play the first 2 tests, it looks like, and it'll be between Usman Khawaja and Travis Head for the number 5 spot.
Do you think they would actually play Khawaja at 5, or is he really there as top order insurance in case one of the top 3 falls over? And I mean, the way I would read it, Head's the incumbent-ish at 5, not quite, not exactly, but he's the one who they've tried to make work at number 5 for so long that it feels pretty obvious that that's who they'll go with, and Khawaja will be their backup.
I probably would have. I mean, I know I already mentioned Maddinson as the opener. I suppose that's because we know that Khawaja isn't going to open. They kind of already ruled that out. But if we were starting from a blank piece of paper, I'd have been tempted to have opened with Khawaja and played Head at 5 as the informed player in the country. But it looks as though they're playing for one spot. Green confirmed as number 6. In other words, Mitchell Marsh isn't there to apply pressure in the immediate term, although thinking this through rationally, if these Australia A players are also going to be part of the quarantine, I assume, because they're playing a game in Brisbane between 1 and 3 December. Then they're playing the game against England's Lions squad, also in Brisbane. So presumably that means that any of Sean Abbott, Ashton Agar, Scott Boland, Alex Carey, Henry Hunt, Josh Inglis, Nick Maddinson, Mitchell Marsh, Matt Renshaw back in town, Mark Steckety or Bryce Street could, in theory, play at Brisbane or Adelaide. And in turn, it means that Mitch Marsh isn't entirely out of calculations, and given he was the player of the World Cup sort of 3 nights ago, it'd be unusual for him to be overlooked entirely. So yeah, I guess they're just about within touching distance, but they play a practice match. Possibles versus probables that used to be called back in the old days. I'm not sure. It'd probably be Australia versus Australia A. Keep it, because Australia or Australia and Australia A.
Well, it was the Haddon 12 and the Hick 12 in Southampton. A game that will go down in history. What a time it was, watching that complete dud of a nonsense performance on one of the weirdest pitches I've ever seen. That was about, I don't know, 20 metres away from the boundary on the far side of the field. Anything you chipped to leg as a right-hander was just sailing over the fence. But yeah, you do what you got to do.
It got Cameron Bancroft in the test team, if I recall, making 80-odd on a
not for long.
Tough track. Not for long, just 2 tests and out, as per. So, yes, the Australian squad, as named, Warner, Harris, Labuschagne, Smith, Head, Green, Payne, Cummins, Stark, Lyon, Hazelwood. That's what Jeff thinks will be the starting 11. That's how he's written it in our shared document. And then the 4 other players, Khawaja, jumping Jai Richardson in the wickets last week for Western Australia, back in the squad. Michael Neser, Mitch Schwepson, fresh from partying with the T20 squad after being awarded. I like how they get World Cup winning medals even if they haven't played. So Schwepson was part of that, and good on him for it. But one other point here when looking at Richardson and Neser, George Bailey is using the R word, rotation, especially about the big fast bowlers who didn't rotate last year across 4 test matches, but across 5. It looks like it'll be more like 2019 in England than it was 17-18 in Australia when the 4 bowlers took all the wickets, Lyon being the spinner. So it probably means that Richardson and Neser will get opportunities through the series, which I think is a good thing. It made sense in 19. It made sense to me last year when they elected not to do it, and it still makes sense heading into what turns out to be about 5 test matches in 6.5 weeks.
Hashtag Neser must play might at last come to fruition. It also means that James Pattinson probably would have played if he had ruled himself in rather than ruling himself out, but he didn't feel that he'd be right he'd be sort of physically ready to go at that level, I suppose, with all the spotlight and scrutiny of an Ashes series, of which he has played a couple. So at least he doesn't have that sort of end of the career thing that he missed out on that front because he was involved a couple of times.
So Australia's squad is named. England are in quarantine. It's all about the kick-off. It's the Ashes of 2021-22. Jeff and I will be making the Ashes Daily every day through that stretch. It would be remiss of me to say that we've been so bloody busy that we haven't quite got our ducks in a row in terms of commercial partnerships for that as yet. If you want to work with us on the Ashes Daily, and by way of background, those do pretty well. People listen to our daily shows more than they listen to our weekly shows. I don't know why, but they do. Hit us up, finalwordcricket@gmail.com if you want to partner with us, not only on the podcast feed, but on YouTube, where we've had, I guess, the better part of 3 million people visit this year, and we've only just started getting serious there. So send Jeff an email. Jeff will pick it up, and we'll have a look through it and see if you want to be doing what we do through the Ashes. We'll be doing a preview show every test match and one each night of the series. Jeff, let's leave it there. Let's have a brief breather, and we'll return with our feature interview today with Taha Hashim and with Nikesh Rughani. It's the final word with Adam Collins and Jeff Lemon. And as we said off the top, today we're conducting a conversation we've been wanting to have for over a year, but we've waited for the right time, and we feel like it's it right now. With us is Taha Hashim of Wisden Cricket Monthly and Nikesh Rughani, freelance broadcaster, mostly of the BBC and more recently on SEN Test Cricket. Yesterday at Westminster, the Select Committee for Culture, Media and Sport heard the compelling and devastating testimony of Azeem Rafiq, speaking in depth about the racist abuse he was subjected to during his Yorkshire career between 2008 and 2018. After Azeem, Tom Harrison, the chief executive of the ECB, and Roger Hutton, who recently stood down as the chairman of Yorkshire County Cricket Club, also spoke and were probed by parliamentarians. It was a massive and historic day, with Azeem's words leading news bulletins around the country. It was you, Taha, who first shared some of Azeem's story in public in an interview some 15 months ago for your magazine. With that in mind, how are you feeling after something you've worked on so diligently is now receiving such widespread attention, with these hard home truths around English cricket now being heard around the world?
Yeah, I mean, first, thanks for having me on. Look, it was a surreal day. It was, like you said, it's been 16 months since I first spoke to Azeem, and it's a story that's gone, it's led to uproar and then quietness, uproar and quietness, and then it all changed 2 weeks ago, but ultimately this was the day that Azeem Rafiq had wanted for so long. He wanted the day that he could speak his truth, and he finally got that day after it's not just about the last 15 months. This is about a guy who'd been in the Yorkshire system since he was a kid, and everything had almost been building up, all those experiences building up for him to speak on this day. And so it felt incredible to see that all happen. I thought he was thoroughly captivating. I thought he was powerful. Look, it's been said how brave he was speaking yesterday, but beyond bravery, there was an eloquence to him. There's one thing being brave, there's one thing, and then there's another putting it all out there for the world to see. And a surreal day, a day that kind of is the start of a new chapter. It's one chapter is really closed now. It was the whole process that he'd been through over the last year and a half, and now it's what happens next. Is this the moment English cricket changes forever? And it kind of feels like it is. It was hard not to witness what happened yesterday and not think this is a transformational moment.
And you spoke to Azeem last night, Taha. How's he going?
Well, I mean, just off a brief phone call, just to see how he was doing. He was tired, he was exhausted. Of course he was exhausted. He'd laid it all out on the line. But there was a sense of relief in his voice too, I think. A relief that he finally got his day to speak freely, to speak the truth he'd wanted out there for so long.
Nikesh, you've been involved in cricket at Leicester and in the media for many years. I suppose it was a significant day for all, British Asians who have experienced in different forms what Azeem have experienced, and you've talked in depth around that. How did you observe yesterday?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing to mention is that for the first time it felt in the UK, certainly in my lifetime, British Asians had a voice in speaking out against racism in sport, be it institutional or just overt, being called the P word. As he mentioned, he was called on many occasions. Lots and lots of people that I've spoken to, who I've played cricket with, who I've grown up with, members of my family, friends, they can all understand exactly those experiences that Azeem Rafiq is talking about. They've lived through those same experiences. And it took until 2021, when you think British Asians have been prominent in the UK since the late 1960s, through the 1970s, there was mass immigration. They've been in England and the UK for many, many years. And it took until 2021 for something like this to be so prominent in the news that people had to take notice. And for a lot of people in the media, they've come out with statements like, oh, this is shocking. Well, to a lot of people like us, it's not right, it's unacceptable, but it doesn't come as a great shock. And it just took great bravery, I feel, from Azeem Rafiq, as Taha mentioned, to come out there and speak the truth and not give up the fight, not, just take the money and run, basically. Don't take a payoff and keep quiet. Nobody was able to buy his silence. And he's taken it all the way to the top. He's taken it to Parliament. He's spoken to the nation, and people can finally understand not only what he went through, but what so many British Asians, boys and girls, would have gone through, not only at sporting organisations, at cricket clubs and places like that, but at school, just growing up in these communities, what it was like. People, thinking the P word is banter, for example. I was so glad when I heard him specifically make the point in Parliament that calling somebody the P word is absolutely not banter, it is racism. And if people don't understand that, well, they need educating, and they need educating fast, because it is unacceptable. And finally, we are seeing it in the limelight. The next question is, what can we do to make things better? What can we do to instigate change?
One further introductory question from me, Nikesh, and it relates to the P word. A lot of our audience are based in Australia. And until very recently, the P word was used purely as an abbreviation for when the Pakistani cricket team came to Australia. Just by way of background, can you explain the origin of the P word in this country and why it isn't just an abbreviation of Pakistani?
Absolutely. In the UK, it means something very different. Look, it's an interesting point you make, because I've seen tweets from people in India on social media, not just on Twitter, on all forms of social media, saying, well, what's wrong with calling somebody the P word? It's just short for Pakistani. It's very, very different in the UK. It's basically used as a derogatory term for all South Asian immigrants into the UK, as I talked about in the 1960s, the 70s and onwards. It was a very derogatory term. It's in many ways similar to the N-word in the way that has been used all around the world, but most prominently in America. Back a few decades ago, when black people were subjected to racism, they still are over there, and the N-word is unacceptable. They seem to have, in some way, the black community in the US has reclaimed that word, and, through rap music and various things like that, they've reclaimed the N-word. But for somebody to call a black person the N-word is completely unacceptable in any place in the world. And the same should be seen for the P word as well. And people outside of the UK may not understand the hurt that causes somebody, but you've just got to ask people like my dad, like my grandparents who came to this country, what that word means to them. And even just hearing it myself, I was, lucky I didn't have to face as much racism as my parents when they came over here, when they were very young and went to school here in the UK. But I was called the P word, and just hearing Azeem Rafiq speak, it takes me back to when I was a teenager, when I was at school, when I was playing at cricket clubs. I was a good player. I was respected as a good player, but it didn't stop people having a banter, as they call it, inverted commas, and and calling me the P word, making jokes about how I smelt of curry and things like that. And looking back on it, I wish I had done more at the time, but, you know, as is the case, you concentrate on your cricket, you concentrate on your schooling, you bat these things off, you feel like there's no real support system when you're in that situation. And hopefully now, kids going forward, my 7-year-old daughter, she won't have to worry about that. I'm her support system. She will have a support system at school, in her employment when she grows up, and things can change as a result of this.
It was interesting. We had the same kinds of arguments being brought up about left arm wrist spin, about why is there anything wrong with using the word Chinaman when you can call someone a Frenchman or whatever it is. But it all comes back to whether that word has been used as a hostile, derogatory word, which Chinaman was. And but these kind of arguments are so often just used to obfuscate and delay. And that's what we've seen from Yorkshire throughout this whole process, is just obfuscation and delay. It was interesting, I thought, that the parliamentary committee was so supportive. Nobody on that committee questioning was antagonistic towards Azeem Rafiq. Was any of that a surprise to you, that there was such a receptive hearing in the halls of government when there had been a complete lack of any reception within cricket itself?
Not particularly, because just because of what's happened in the last couple of weeks. I think there's a sort of universality about this whole situation in the last couple of weeks, where everyone understands what a mess it's been by Yorkshire. There aren't really any sides to this, and that's refreshing in a way. What sometimes happens with debates of racism in this country is that it becomes a two sides thing when it really doesn't have to be that. And so that's almost been a weirdly refreshing thing about this whole thing. Where there's not really becoming a debate now. It's clear. Like you can't say that. You know, I'm sure there are people out there who would still minimise it, who will still argue that this is dressing room banter. It's an everyday thing. It's, you know, deal with it. But I think overwhelmingly the voices that are being heard are saying on across all sides that, this was unacceptable.
Yeah, I'd agree with Taha there. It is refreshing that it has been, by the majority accepted as this has been a disgrace, really, the way it's been handled, not only by Yorkshire, but just, overall by everybody involved, really. It wasn't taken seriously enough at the time. The whole movement has gathered momentum, and Azeem Rafiq, as a result, has gained a lot of support from not only the British Asian community, but from all communities in the UK and in cricket, really. When you look at the vast majority, this is unacceptable. It's interesting as well that you see certain players who were named, and there are statements been coming out of Tim Bresnan, for example, who's now at Warwickshire, was at Yorkshire, of course, was a former teammate of Azeem Rafiq, and he came out and apologised and said, look, I didn't realise what I was saying at the time was so offensive to you, and whether you accept his apology or not, the fact he has come out and apologised and been made to think that what he said is not acceptable. It wasn't acceptable then, it isn't acceptable now, and he's acknowledged that. He is at Warwickshire, he works with their academy. Their academy is made up of a lot of South Asian heritage cricketers as well, in the Birmingham and surrounding areas. So he has realised that he made a mistake, and I think it's good that people who may have got caught up in this sort of dressing room culture and these social nights out, as Azeem called, down the pub or wherever it might be, and just insults being thrown left, right and centre. There is a line, and you do not cross that line. And once you cross that line, you will be called out. And that has to be the message that is taken from this. And if it makes former cricketers, current cricketers who've been involved in this kind of chat and kind of abuse being thrown at South Asian cricketers, at black cricketers, whoever it might be, making them realise that this is unacceptable is the first step, and then how to change that culture going forward is the next challenge.
Yeah, and I suppose, Taha, the way this was responded to initially after you filed your story is emblematic of that, it doesn't matter an awful lot. Because let's be honest, your story didn't prompt a response from Yorkshire. It was when there was multiple reports, and then George DeBell, of course, at Cricinfo. Then they launched the report, and then from what we heard yesterday, there were efforts to scupper the whole thing and not even go ahead with it. And all that time, all that delay, all that diversion, the release on the day the Old Trafford Test match was cancelled, for example, there was a sense that within the corridors of power at Yorkshire, they were quite comfortable to dismiss this as actually not that important, and besmirching the character of Azeem Rafiq seemed like the first line of defence.
Yeah, and just that sort of constant lack of transparency, like you said there. When I first did the interview, I approached Yorkshire for comment. They said no comment. It took Cricinfo, and they are a significantly bigger website than the website I work for, wisdom.com. It took that story to really prompt the report, basically. But even then, even when we were sort of getting, when Yorkshire got the findings, basically, initially they said, we'd like to apologise to Azeem for, inappropriate behaviour. And it was only afterwards where eventually they were sort of forced to say he was the victim of racial harassment. A constant kind of pulling back and sort of, trying to save reputations to just try and minimise and just hide everything. And it caught up with them in the end. It got too big, basically.
It's an extraordinary process when you look at how much this has been dragged out. Taha, just walk us through it, if you can, in the Cliff Notes version from start to finish. The number of times that they've tried to duck it, cover it, say that they've got the report finished but they won't release it, say that they will release it but they'll only release bits of it. Like, they've been absolutely dragged kicking and screaming all the way, and still it seems like Yorkshire haven't actually embraced the need to change. There are still strong elements at the club who want to bunker down and hope that somehow this will blow over and attention will go elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to go right back to the start, I interviewed Azeem. It would have been actually July 2020. The interview was published in August. And then I think there was a sort of a 2-week gap where, Azeem does another interview with a podcast. He started with me in terms of he opened up a bit. When he did the podcast, he opened up a bit more. And then it got to speaking to George DeBell, who's been, incredible in what he's done in this process and the journalism he's produced. It took that interview for Azeem to say outright that he thought Yorkshire was institutionally racist and that he'd been driven to the brink of suicide. And that became the headline. And there was no going back from there. Yorkshire then say, they sort of commission this report, they talk of this independent panel, but the story does go quiet for a really long time because we're waiting for this report to come out. Meanwhile, at the same time, Rafiq is there waiting and I guess, losing faith in whatever's going to come out, It was, I guess, this August where Yorkshire said, look, we've got the findings of the report. I mean, initially, I'm fairly certain in terms of their timeline that they said it would be a few months, but then, it just dragged out. And then in August, they said they've got the findings. And that's when they first say, look, Azeem Rafiq was the victim of inappropriate behaviour. And obviously, the frustration that would have caused him. I mean, he made that frustration clear. Inappropriate behaviour is a very different thing to racial abuse. And then it comes to September where we don't get the report. We still don't have the report, of course, even to this day, in the public domain. Yorkshire produced their own summary of the report. They released it on the morning of that cancelled test match between England and India, that 5th test at Old Trafford. And it outlines that 7 of Rafiq's allegations have been upheld, that he was the victim of racial harassment and bullying. What happens afterwards, of course, is that Yorkshire then say, we've reviewed the findings, these are the actions we're going to take, and they're not going to punish anyone at the club. And that, of course, leads to a sense of uproar, but not the uproar that's led to where we are today. I think the key moment this whole story shifts really is the 1st of November this month, where George DeBell releases, the raw report's been leaked, and he reports that story which says that the P word was used to banter. And that is the moment really where this whole story changes. it's that week that MPs intervene, sponsors pull out. Once sponsors pull out, the harsh reality is that it's money that changes everything, and then the ECB weigh in, and
Yeah, I mean, all hell broke loose. I mentioned it in the intro that leading the TV news, cricket in England, really? I mean, it doesn't happen, but for all the wrong reasons here. And then, the idea of racial abuse was just underpinned by pretty much everything Azeem Rafiq said in the first half an hour of his testimony yesterday, about the open secret of the isolation and humiliation that he was subjected to, the inhuman treatment, as he described it, when he lost his son, when the types of terminology which became common practice, the names that were used for players of Asian origin, the fact that someone else named a dog after that term. It just got worse and worse and worse, didn't it? And this was the first time that Azeem Rafiq was given the chance to detail this under parliamentary privilege, essentially, that he had the right to say what he needed to say, and thus the coverage yesterday. But then we go back into the usual place, the culture war, which is something I suppose we're all familiar with, regrettably. The term institutional racism lives fair and square in the culture war. People don't like it. A lot of people do not like the term, and we see that's where the debates move to. But even the former chairman of Yorkshire was forced to acknowledge in his testimony yesterday that it's almost impossible to avoid, when you hear Azeem Rafiq put it as plainly as he did yesterday, that there are elements of institutional racism at play here which go far beyond the individual.
Yeah, I mean, Roger Hudson, sort of, the chair who resigned from the club, just a couple of weeks ago, he outlined just a culture unwilling to change, a culture unwilling to apologise, a culture unwilling to listen, and listen is the key word here. One of the most powerful things I thought yesterday was Rafiq recalling him giving an interview to Sky. This would have been last year. And the next day getting a phone call from Matthew Hoggard, who had said a lot of hurtful things to Rafiq when he was a young player. Matthew Hoggard, who of course played for England, I'm sure someone Rafiq looked up to, someone I looked up to as a kid. And Hoggard just saying, I'm really sorry, and apologising, and
yep.
It was really powerful when Rafiq said, wow, thank you for that. And
that's all he wanted, right? And you go back to it, like, if that was the attitude taken to Rafiq when he first raised these concerns to the club, or when he first spoke to the media last year, this could be a very different story today.
If you think about it, it's such a simple process.
Yeah.
Matthew Hoggard listened. He understood his behaviour was completely wrong. He apologised. We all move on. It's a human being learning. It's a human being who made mistakes, a human being who was product of an environment that was always going to force him to make those mistakes, right? And so I thought that passage has probably been overlooked by the more, the headlines and the more negative headlines, if you know what I mean, in terms of, balance and that kind of thing. But there's power in that story that kind of symbolises everything that's also gone wrong in this process.
Yeah, you'd think that looking at this story from the outside, there would be people who didn't know a whole lot about it who'd be saying, oh, who is this guy, making this trouble, kicking up this fuss and all the rest of it. I think that the core of this is that Azeem Rafiq the entire time has said all he wanted was for this to be dealt with, was for the club to look at it, for the players involved to look at it, to accept what had happened, to hear what he had to say, and that's what they refused to do. I'm interested in the perspective of both of you guys, Nikesh and Taha, from if you're in this kind of position, the disincentive to do anything about it on the basis that you will be seen to be a quote-unquote troublemaker seems like such a powerful thing. It's such a smothering, it makes it impossible to want to take this up, to want to bring these issues forward, to want to make accusations when they need to be made, because it will be turned on you that you are now the source of that. You are the one who's created the problem, rather than the people who've created the problem by offending against you.
And I thought that was the most powerful thing that came out of what Azeem Rafiq was saying, really, and ultimately he was asked if he thought racism had ended his career, and he said yes, and that's basically exactly what happened. He's still a young man. He still could easily be playing top-level cricket. He certainly had the talent to do so. Captain of Yorkshire, captain of the England under-19s. There's no reason why he couldn't have had a much longer and successful county career at least. The fact that he brought this up, he was effectively pushed out of the club, and 2017 was when he first made his sort of initial complaint, I suppose. I don't know how formal the process was at Yorkshire, but that's when he first brought up this issue of being dealt with a little bit differently. At that time, he addressed it as bullying. He thought he was being bullied, when in fact it was more than just bullying. It was simple racism. He was receiving racist abuse on almost a daily occurrence, really. And it's not only in cricket, Jeff. It's whether you work in an office and you're hearing this kind of talk going on behind your back, to your face, whatever it might be. People are afraid to take it up with their boss because they, ultimately will be seen as a troublemaker. This has gone on for generations in the UK. Countless stories that I've heard of people who've just got a normal job. They might be an accountant, or, they might work in a call centre or whatever it might be. They have faced racism, and they will be angry about it. They'll go home and tell their friends and family about it, but they won't necessarily take up a formal process with their employer, because they'll probably be sacked at the end of it, or even if they're not sacked or pushed out in some way or another, they'll be given less responsibility, they won't get promotions in the future, and it will affect their career. And the same has happened to Azeem. It's probably happened to countless other people within sport, within cricket as well. And this really is a watershed moment that, look, you can speak out, you have to speak out, and now it's not seen as such a taboo to talk about racism and to talk about being racially abused, and hopefully more people will come out and speak out against this as a result.
Yeah, it's interesting that sort of that term, the troublemaker, and now I'm curious as to, because now we've seen a shift in the last couple of weeks where clubs, Yorkshire themselves, but other county cricket clubs, Surrey, Essex, they're saying, come to us. We're sort of welcoming people to come talk about their experiences. Maybe this is the shift that English cricket now, like you say, it's not just cricket, maybe society as well, but in terms of English cricket specifically, we see sort of, people are obviously coming forward now. They're talking about their experiences, and now maybe we stop with that terminology. We stop looking at these people as disruptors. It's just, you just hope that there's a shift in attitude, an opening of arms, and saying, look, people, come. There's no judgment here. Just come and talk about your experiences.
Tom Harrison, the chief executive of the ECB, when speaking to the select committee yesterday, said that if we're not in an emergency yet, we are now. This existential threat. I mean, the ECB has spent a lot of time and invested a lot of resources too in trying to engage the South Asian community, but the reputational damage, the profound reputational damage based on what appears to be this inertia at ECB Towers, which Harrison's now saying they have to fix, and fix it fast. I wonder in what form that will take, Taha, to the extent to which, how can they fix it fast when there is so much hurt? I mean, it feels as though we need an extended period of people being able to come out and share their stories and tell their truth before we can even get close to fixing this, to use his terminology.
Yeah, I think we're still not at that stage in terms of what to do next. I think we're still at the stage of, we need to hear from everyone. They're opening it up and they're saying, everyone come forward. And that's when you can get to the stage of what to do next, because that is such a huge question. Because I really don't know. I don't know how you build back up. In terms of the Yorkshire, if I wanted to go specifically and talk about Yorkshire and what they do next, I think it's so important for them. It's a very tough task for them. Lord Patel's come in as chair, and I think that's a really good appointment. He is he just a bit of background on Lord Patel. He was born in Kenya. He came to Bradford as a baby. He grew up in that Yorkshire cricketing culture. He was there. He experienced racism. He was chased by skinheads. He said himself, "I was a very good runner as a kid because he was getting chased by skinheads." He saw Asian players forced to create their own leagues and play amongst themselves because they were ignored by a culture and a club that had its own birthright policy. You had to be born in Yorkshire to play for it until the early 90s. Yorkshire was an exclusionary force, unlike any other in English cricket. And look, it seems very clear that it remains so till this day. That club itself has made progress, I don't know. I mean, but it has made attempts to reach out to the South Asian community. It's had British Asian players filter through the system, and it did do in the early 2000s, where you then did have Adnan Rasad, Azeem Rafiq, Adil Rashid playing together. But even that's dried up. And the key thing for me is getting to that level of representation again. That's so important, to have more Asian players in that first team, to help rebuild that trust with the communities around the place, those communities that are hurting right now. But that's also a very long-term process, because you need to make sure you have these players coming through the academy, getting into the first team. That takes time. What they do in the short term is what interests me, and where Lord Patel will be key, because he knows this experience. He has heart in this. He's lived his whole life in that culture, and so it means a great deal to him. And so what he does in the short term, what the club does in the short term to rebuild that trust, God, it's a big task, isn't it?
I would absolutely agree with that, and it is about representation, because whenever something like this happens, and obviously nothing as big as this has ever shook English cricket before, but within any sport, the Football Association in England has been guilty of saying they're going to combat this problem of discrimination and racism within the game by reaching out to the community, by engaging in grassroots football, and cricket has been the same. The ECB came up with something called a South Asian Action Plan a couple of years ago. I mean, nothing's really happened as a result of that. It was all about reaching out to grassroots players, getting more people involved in organised cricket. That's not the problem. Over a third of all recreational cricketers, club cricketers at amateur level in England and Wales are from the South Asian community. They play, they engage with the game. They participation is not a problem. And amongst those 1/3, there are a lot of talented players who sometimes do make it into the academies, the under 13s, 14s, 15s, whatever it might be, of these counties. I was one of them. And, when I was at Leicestershire in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, there were a fair few other British Asians within the squad as well. None of them made it through to the first team. In fact, it took until 2006. When you think about it, in Leicester, which for those of you who don't know is one of the most multicultural cities within the United Kingdom, massive Indian community that came in the 1960s and into the early 70s as well. So you're talking about the mid to late 1960s. Asians have been heavily populated in a city like Leicester, playing organised cricket in a city like Leicester, in all the top divisions. Let's make no bones about it. They're not playing in their own made-up Asian leagues, which we often hear about. They're playing in the proper Leicestershire leagues. And it took until 2006 for the first locally born Asian player, to play for the county. You think about the generations that have just been skipped over there. Something is not right. And, as Taha said, there was that sort of moment where 3 British Asians were playing for Yorkshire in the early 2000s, as he mentioned there. That's a very rare occurrence. It hasn't happened since. Will it happen again? Will we see it at any county again? And 3 Asian players in a county side shouldn't be a shock anymore. It should be the norm. That's representing what is going on the ground at grassroots level all the way through club level. And that is what angers most people that the ECB will just come out, or clubs will come out with another scheme. Oh, we need to reach out to community leaders. Well, what is a community leader? I mean, most of them are self-appointed anyway. They've got no, they've got no power over anyone in the community, in any community. You need to just find that solution as to, are you institutionally racist? If so, why are you not appointing the right people in your academies, in your scouting networks to go and find these cricketers? Just pick them on their talent. Pick the best players. If that means you're picking 8 Asian players in say Leicestershire County Cricket Club's first team, fine, do that. If there's a generation where there's more talented, white English players, pick them. Just pick people on their talent and make sure that overall, over the course of time, that county cricket and English cricket as a whole represents society. And that's all we're asking for, really. We're not asking for, we need to get more Asians involved in cricket to pick up a cricket bat and all that. There's enough of them, trust me. It's the problem of representation at the top level.
I suspect the headlines out of the testimony will mostly be about big names. It'll all be about who's been implicated, players who've played for England, Gary Ballance, Alex Hales, Michael Vaughan, David Lloyd, etc. It's whoever is the most prominent person who's been implicated, and it will then become about personality rather than procedure, I suppose. We've already had some of these kind of half-hearted apologies. We've had the responses that I'm not a racist when it's not about racism being a personal characteristic. It's about, did you do something racist? Racism manifests in action, not in opinion. But it seems like all of that focus will be going the wrong way when it needs to be about what is actually supposed to happen. One of the things I found frustrating with the questioning from the parliamentary committee was asking Azeem Rafiq a lot of the time, what should be done? What should Yorkshire do? What should the ECB do? As though the person who brings the problem to their attention also needs to bring a solution with it. And I think, like you alluded to before, Taha, there's very much a drive to say, here's what we're going to do next, when actually now is the time to be listening to people, not to be trying to launch the next initiative. How does that happen? Like, where can things go from here in a way that's not just a T-shirt slogan, let's all move forward together, like a Joe Root statement?
Yeah, on your first point, that's something I've been sort of interested in as well, sort of reading the headlines, and there's almost sort of a level of immaturity sometimes when you see that focus on individuals, as if it's kind of you're sort of in the school playground sort of pointing out, oh, this person's that, this person said that, when you're not understanding what the everyone here is part of that same culture. Like you said there, I mean, that question of what should everyone do next, and everyone asking each other that question, it still boils down to us being at a stage where we have to listen to everyone. Everyone's just started to come forward, and we're still at that listening stage. I can almost sympathize with the authorities in a way where the task is so big, and I'm myself, look here, I'm not really getting anywhere. I'm not sure where this goes next, because we are still at the stage where we have to listen to everyone who's opening up their experiences. People are now citing Rafiq as someone who look, because Azeem said this, I'm now going to talk about my experiences that go back a few years, and that's just going to keep coming for a while, I think, and we still have to just be at that stage. Yeah,
it's like we need to step back from the individuals and go, well, they said that, we need to have them, I mean, for want of a better term, cancelled, in favour of stepping back and acknowledging where the institutional issues are that we were touching on before. Because, I mean, it's not as though any club is going to come out of this without individuals within it having had problems over the journey. I think that much is clear already in the anecdotal evidence. In different countries, for that matter, in different clubs in different countries, I mean, this is going to be the start of something that requires a lot of people to reflect and consider the decisions they've made as younger people. And hopefully, I mean, this is a bold ambition, I suppose, but I don't think an unrealistic one after yesterday. We can turn around in a decade and say there is a lot less racism in cricket. I mean, Nikesh, wouldn't that be the best possible thing to come of this, that we turn around in a generation and say this was a watershed where people took stock and took responsibility for their actions, and that the game itself can get beyond this, and it doesn't need to become about how many people are personally forced to walk the plank. It's more about how can the entire institution, the entire game, acknowledge where for generations it's been falling woefully short of the mark.
Absolutely, because the moment you start cancelling people or sacking them from their positions that they're currently in, some people will think, oh, well, that's the problem solved. He said this, he's gone anyway, so it doesn't matter anymore. And that you're in danger of going down that road when the problem is much bigger, as we keep referring to. It's institutional. It is run through cricket clubs in the United Kingdom for generations and has just been allowed to be the status quo. And that culture, that has to change. Cricket clubs have to be more welcoming. And when I talk about clubs, I'm talking about professional clubs, in particular county cricket clubs and overall the ECB, when players sort of make it to that more elite level. It has to be more welcoming. It has to be more understanding of cultural differences and what can be said, what can't be said, what is bullying, what is racism. None of that stuff should exist within a dressing room. Of course there's a room for banter. Of course you're going to take the mick out of your mates. That's what happens in all sports dressing rooms. I did it. I've had the mick taken out of me as well. Sometimes I didn't like what was being said, but as long as it didn't cross a certain line into racism and being made to feel basically like shit because of the colour of your skin, and I'm going to be blunt about it. That's how it used to make me feel at times when it crossed a certain point. And I was fortunate that I would stand up for myself in those situations. But there's a lot of young people, boys and girls, who perhaps would never have faced anything like that previously. And the first time they encounter racism, they'll be in shock. They'll have all sorts of emotions running through them. You can't let young people feel like that in any kind of sporting environment. And you're right. It's a big problem within the game that needs to be eradicated. How we do it, there's no simple solution really. How do you change dressing room culture? How do you sort of change what has been going on for many decades, many generations? It can be done. Perhaps having the right people running these clubs, coaching these clubs in academies as well will lead to some sort of change. Ultimately, it's all about education. Some people will have heard their parents use the P word. They won't know what effect the P word can have on another young child, another one of their teammates, their school colleagues, whatever it might be. They won't know. They'll just repeat the word. If your dad's saying it, if your dad's driving down the street and he has a bit of road rage against a driver from a South Asian background, may use the P word, oh, you effing P or whatever. And kids will repeat this kind of stuff. So it's about education. We need to get to them young. We need to make kids understand what racism is, why it's such a bad thing, what you can't say to people, how it makes people feel. And hopefully eventually we find some sort of solution to embed that into our game, because I tell you what, it's very toxic at the moment, and it can be a very toxic place in those dressing rooms within county setups as well. And if you're in the minority, honestly, you just want the world to swallow you up at times. That's how it makes you feel, and we can't allow that.
Nikesh, what stood out to me most in the testimony today, and it was when Azeem Rafiq was being asked about Joe Root, and obviously there's a lot of interest in Joe Root because he's the England captain, he's Yorkshire's biggest star. The questions are, how did he not know about it? He's saying, I never heard any racist abuse being used there. And when Azeem was asked about it, he said, Joe was out with them on nights when he was being racially abused in a way that was supposedly friendly and all of the rest of it. And the line that he said was basically that Joe probably wouldn't remember it because it doesn't mean anything to him. And he said, "I think about it every day." That really stood out. How much of, you're talking about your experience of similar things. How much of the hurt is because other people won't recognise that anything has actually been done to you? You've been injured in this way, but other people are not even pretending it's nothing, but assuming it's nothing, not even recognising that anything has been done.
It's massive, and that was very powerful what Azeem said, and he did go on to say that Joe Root is a good guy. He's one of the good guys. However, he was there, and things were said to me which he would have heard at the time. It just shows you how common practice this is. It's been normalised in certain scenarios within English cricket that such and such was said to a South Asian player. Oh, it's not racist, it's just a bit of banter, just a bit of fun, it's team bonding, whatever you might want to call it. But the fact that Azeem still remembers it to this day and is still so, visibly hurt by what was said to him all those years back, he's one of many. It's so much more frustrating when somebody just can't recognise that something so offensive has been said to you and how much it hurts you. They can't see the hurt. They can't feel the hurt. They've not experienced it themselves. Yes, and if you're not a brown person, you probably won't be called the P word. So it's not their fault they haven't been racially abused. We don't want anybody to be racially abused. But the fact that these guys like Joe Root wouldn't have ever had that kind of abuse hurled at them, They can brush it off quite easily, but it's, as a South Asian person in those situations, it hurts so much that it is, as a kid, you can go and complain to your parents, they can go and complain to your teachers or your coaches or whatever it might be. But certainly in my situation, it was just sort of brushed off and nothing was done. And, maybe the coach would pretend to have a word with such and such player, cut it out. Behave yourself, and that's it. Little slap on the wrist, and let's move on. In those situations, it is like banging your head against a brick wall. There seems like there's no end game. You're not going to ever solve this problem, and as I keep saying, hopefully Azeem speaking out and this story being so prominent, leading the news bulletins in the UK in recent times, will go on to change that. But yeah, people need to realise exactly what offence is being caused by using the P word, by making racial slurs, by using the N word, by, even if you're sexist or homophobic or whatever it might be, all this kind of abuse that people receive, the abusers can give it out, they can just brush it off, they can go home, have a good night's sleep, not knowing that the person they've abused 20 years down the line will still remember how hurt they felt when you said that.
Yeah, that all really tallies with me, what you were saying there about dressing rooms, right? I mean, I'm sure I was part of dressing rooms when I was younger where there was racial abuse dished out. I can think of one quite prominent example about 6 years ago where an Asian kid came to my club. This was in Melbourne, I should say, not in the UK. Maybe 6 or 7 years ago now. And he was only there about 4 months. I mean, the profound teasing of this kid, and you can call it nothing but, in hindsight, racist abuse. But on the lower level, it was like that microaggression level, which meant he didn't feel comfortable at the club and he was gone within half a season. I could have intervened. I could have stepped up and said, this is bullshit. But it's easier in a dressing room situation to turn the other cheek, isn't it? And I wonder whether this might be the lasting legacy of what's happened yesterday. Azeem making that point around Joe Root, saying, look, he's someone he respects, a good guy, a good leader. And even if someone like Joe Root has been able to not process that abuse that he was receiving through that stretch of time when he was a Yorkshire player, by that I mean playing regularly with Yorkshire and not so much with England when Azeem was at the club, that's a lesson I think a lot of white cricketers can take from this, that yes, dressing rooms can be a nasty place. They can be full of bullying and piss-taking that goes too far, and teasing, and I'm sure that's the same up and down the nation, no matter what country you're playing cricket in. But when it comes to the racist component of this, that when it starts to seed into a dressing room culture, that white people might be more aware of it and more willing to put their head above the parapet rather than leaving it to the poor person on the other end of the abuse to have to wear that burden alone.
Yeah. Just that example you give there with that Asian player coming to your club, would there have been other Asian players in that dressing room? Or?
Well, yes, there was in my club. I just remember I have quite strong recollections of feeling very uncomfortable about what was happening to this particular guy, and not, for whatever reason, not taking it upon myself at the time to stand up for him. And I regret that. I've regretted it for years. I should have had more backbone about me at the time. But whether I was busy or distracted or whatever else, and it wasn't long before it was too late. Very talented young spin bowler who is probably 19 or 20. And look, and again, I don't want to put myself inside the story, but all I'm saying is that this is a very relatable thing that Azeem was saying yesterday about Joe Root. Because I think if you step back and reflect upon it as a white cricketer, how could you be naive to what you've been privy to without necessarily processing it at the time, just due to the way that dressing rooms can be and how easily it can wade into this dreadful water.
So one thing, look, we talked about a bit earlier was having the representation of players, but it's not just in terms of players. Like, I'm sort of imagining a young kid, Asian kid, coming through. You know, it could be just a local cricket club, but an academy as well. And it's so I spoke a year ago. I spoke to Tom Fletcher, who's an academic, who's actually been mentioned in the news, you know, today. And
wrote a report, didn't he?
Yeah, because he's done great work in terms of trying to pin down this culture of Yorkshire cricket, where you have a culture of otherness. And I spoke to him last year, and I've got it in front of me, and he talks about, you know, there may well be Asian cricketers coming through that system, but this is what he said. He said, "My worry is that while they might get through to the system at a certain level, that the system then doesn't know how to handle them. That's not to say they're more difficult than other groups, but they're probably different to what people who are coaching them are used to. So the key thing is there that you have to have a more diverse coaching environment. You need people in that dressing room who understand these players, who are of a similar background to them." I think that's a key point of this argument there. Like you said there, it's important for everyone to stand up and say, look, this is not okay. But it's definitely, it would be easier for that young kid who's coming through to also see people who are of similar background to him, and for those people then stand up as well. And so that's why the key thing here is not just about having more representation on a playing level, it's about having more representation on a coaching level and all the levels above. Because that it can't just be reflected at one level, you know. And if you think about it, a young player coming through, that's, you know, they're the most, you know, that's something precocious. There's pressure. You need to really take care of them, basically, right, for them to get through to that system. And so then it becomes very important for the levels above to be represented as well.
Taha, one of the major concerns is that I think this, particularly as white people being somewhat removed from this, you know, it doesn't affect us directly, is that we have an optimism problem, I reckon. Something like a story like this happens, the testimony gets heard, we see it all as very cathartic. We go, oh, good, well, I'm glad that's been said. Now that's all been brought out in the open and everything will be fine from now on. Azeem Rafiq was saying there are plenty of players who've been in contact with him, but a lot of them are younger players. They're towards the start of their careers. They don't want to speak out because they've still got something to lose. He doesn't. He's free to speak his mind because whatever opportunities he might have had have been lost to him. Others don't have that problem. But seeing it as now everything's come out in the open, it will be okay. It's kind of soothing, but it's bullshit as well. The problem doesn't go away just on being called out here. It doesn't stop here. There's no reason why these kind of things won't continue or couldn't continue unless actual quite drastic interventions are made to change the way that people behave in an ongoing way, rather than treating this as one thing or a historic thing, a sequence of events, and now it's all concluded, it's all nicely wrapped up, and we can all go on with our lives feeling better about ourselves. Yeah,
it's interesting. It's almost like a test for whether this is more than a moment, whether this is a transformational thing. It's a test to see whether, like you said, Rafiq there, he's out of the professional game. He said it afterwards when he's got nothing to lose, and he's accepted that he's not coming back. It's almost a test to see now if you have current players or young players who are just able and willing and open and able to say to the public, this is what I'm going through. And so if those players come out and talk about their experiences, that for me would represent something different that's not happened in the game before, right? Because you do have players come out after a career and talk about their experiences. Before Rafiq, Michael Carberry did it last year. We've seen it with Michael Holding and Ebony, and so are we now moving to a moment where current players and young players, academy players, they're just like they outright say it. It's almost a test, really, isn't it?
Absolutely, and when you talk about the sort of academy players as well, that's the real test, because they have got everything to lose. Perhaps if you're a professional player, if you're a key player in the first team of a county side, they might not be able to afford to lose you. They might take your concerns seriously. If you're an academy player, you are dispensable to them. They can get rid of you with a click of fingers, really, and it will make no difference to their setup unless they perhaps see you as the next Sachin Tendulkar or whoever it might be, unless you are that sort of outstanding player. They have got a lot to lose by speaking up. So it will be interesting to see, because not only have Yorkshire come up with this sort of whistleblowing hotline, as they call it, for anyone to ring up and talk about the abuse that they're currently facing or have faced in the past at the club. Other clubs have done it as well. Leicestershire have done it. There's been several clubs across the country. The ECB say they're going to do something similar as well. So it will be interesting to see if there are any young players, current players, who do speak up, and also if they wish to come out publicly and say so as well. Because let's not make a mistake, it does. The Azeem Rafiq story only came to light really because of the media, because of people like yourself, Taha, and George Debelle, and the sort of backing that he's had from the media to be able to tell his story. And the critics of this, the deniers, the people who don't think there's any sort of institutional racism, will say, it's trial by media. He had no other option. So let's hope that these young players, coming up now, if they face any kind of problems, they don't have to go to the media to get themselves heard. They can be heard by their own clubs, by their own organisations, schools, teachers, whatever it might be, and the problem can be solved there and then, because that is when we will be making real progress.
Yeah, that's really well put. In farewelling the two of you today, I congratulate you on your work and what you've been able to achieve as journalists when covering Azeem Rafiq's story. It couldn't have been easy. In particular, our gratitude for having this long conversation with our audience here today on The Final Word, in the aftermath of what will hopefully end up going down as one of the most important interventions in the modern history of English cricket.
Thanks, mate. Thanks, guys.
Final word, Adam Collins and Jeff Lemon. Thanks again to Taha and Nikesh for being such giving guests. Nikesh mentioned it at the end, but having no time limit on an interview like that. In fact, he mentioned it after we turned off the tape. A lot of our friends who work in the cricket media have been doing loads of interviews around this, and it can be kind of hard to capture what's wrong with race relations inside cricket in the space of a soundbite over a 4 or 5 minute interview. But I think that's why it was so nice to have those two fine journalists on our program to give some thoughtful and detailed answers.
I think we're very fortunate that we work with a lot of really dedicated people with a lot of integrity, and it's a privilege really to be able to work alongside these people and hear what they have to say and bring that to a wider audience as well. So thanks to both of them for spending so much time with us.
Yeah, and also it can be quite exhausting if you are Taha or Nikesh, who are receiving, I mean, without labouring the point, they are getting peppered with requests to do these radio and TV spots all day long. And, they do some of them, but they were both keen to come and talk to us because they know that we are able to give them that space. And, thanks to them for making it all possible. Just as a sort of thought that I had when we finished up on this, Jeff, which, I sort of inserted myself in the story there, and I didn't mean to, but just my own experience of seeing it up front in Australian cricket recently, and there are loads of examples of racism in Australian cricket, by the way, both on and off the field. I've seen some revolting stuff off the field, even indeed within the cricket media, which just, floats on by because the path of least resistance, right? And we've got to be better at that. But dressing rooms, this idea that dressing rooms bring out the worst in people, and the adversarial sport is part of that as well. I don't think we should sort of skip over that point. Sure, cricket's part of the broader community and racism's a community and societal problem. I just wonder whether it's more acute in sport and in cricket, and we need to be mindful of that point too, that there is this idea, sitting around for hours and hours in dressing rooms, be it in professional teams or club teams. It's not an environment that's conducive to perhaps being your best self.
It's very much about, it's particularly a masculine thing, not to say it doesn't happen in women's sport. I'm sure there's some pretty dire situations there as well, but it seems so much of it is about people's idea of what being a man means, and that it being sensitive or being considerate is weak, and that being tough, being a smart ass is getting stuck into people, and it's all about, good, clean, masculine, macho fun. And when you're in a sporting environment, that's also a place where you're supposed to be your most masculine self. You're supposed to prove yourself physically on the field of combat. And you put those two things together, and that is the way it's likely to go. And so that is how it'll go until that idea, that sort of terror, there is this absolute terror of not being a proper man, not being the way that you think men are supposed to be, and that if you don't act like that, you'll be found out by those around you, and they'll realise that you don't really belong there, and they'll turn on you and they'll savage you. So you have to be as much of a prick as possible so that everybody will recognise that you're a proper man. It's a recipe for emotional stunting, and it's like so much of that idea about what a man is supposed to be is about, it's just a list of things you're not allowed to do. It's all about you can't do this, you can't like that, you can't wear that, you can't eat that, you can't drink that. There's nothing positive in it. There's nothing about what you should be, what you are allowed to do. It's all about the things that are prohibited to you. And so that's where the root of so much of this stuff comes from, I think, and that's the part that really needs to change for anything else to change.
Yeah, and that's really well put. And I kind of also was drawn to thinking about the Australian rules example in all of this. Now, to listeners who are not from south of the Barassi line, this may not mean an awful lot to you, but Aussie rules had an absolutely dreadful relationship with Indigenous Australia especially. And I'm not saying it's perfect now, by the way, not at all, but it was acutely bad through the 70s and 80s when Aboriginal players started entering the big leagues, if you like. And then again, really, into the 90s. And there were some well-documented examples in the 90s. I'm thinking of Damien Munkhorst and Michael Long, for instance, where a light was shone on it and it forced people to pay attention. And a club like Collingwood, for instance, who at the time, their president, Alan McAllister, responded to that in a way that was, well, kind of in keeping with what we've seen from Yorkshire, really, in recent months and across the course of the last year, basically saying it's all bullshit. Now, again, I'll pick my words carefully here because Collingwood have not covered themselves in glory recently, far, far from it. But the game as a whole, there has been this acceptance of Indigenous culture. There's been an understanding that it needs to be celebrated, and I think that has helped with some obvious horrible examples to the contrary. But taken as a whole, the game has made massive strides in terms of representation of Indigenous players, in terms of celebrating the culture that they come from, be it through rounds that are dedicated to Indigenous players and beyond, jumpers that are worn. I think about my own club, Hawthorn. We did not have an Indigenous player ever play play for Hawthorn or drafted to Hawthorn until 2000. That exclusionary policy of drafting, was it implicit institutional racism at Hawthorn at the time? Like, it's hard to say it wasn't. Why were other clubs selecting Aboriginal players and my club wasn't? You press fast forward 10 years from then, not even 10 years, and there was half a dozen to 10 players with Aboriginal backgrounds on the list because they had a change in focus, and that changed the conversation entirely. Now, I'm not saying that it's a copy-paste job from Australian rules, but there probably are some lessons there about what was done through that period between the mid-90s and maybe the 15 years that followed, and where some of the bits that have actually worked can now be retrofitted to English cricket, where there's clearly a problem that's of a similar substance.
Yeah, and I mean, so much of it is about the demographics of the sport. Like, it's notable that in a sport like Australian rules, where, say, the Indigenous population nationwide is 2 to 3%, and on Aussie rules lists, it's been anywhere from 9 to 13% of the listed AFL players in the last sort of 10, 15 years, versus Australian cricket, where you can point to maybe half a dozen Indigenous players across the entirety of professional Australian cricket. There's a problem when you can easily name all of them. That's when it shows you that's where the issue is. And so, there's clearly an issue with massive underrepresentation of British Asian players in cricket in the UK. That's something Azeem Rafiq talked about a lot. 4% of top listed professional players are English Asian or British Asian, when they're a much bigger percentage of the sort of community playing ranks. So until you get more representation, you're going to still run into this idea that these sort of players are the outsiders, the exceptions, the unusual, and those are the people who get targeted.
All right, Jeff, that might be where we leave it. I find it kind of, just thinking when you were talking there, that's the third time we've basically done a full program this year on racism. I mean, we'll keep doing this. We'll keep doing it. And some people probably won't like it. That's fine. If you've listened to this,
they won't be listening to this bit of the show. Yeah, hot tip.
They'll have
they've
turned
heard the
off.
bit at the end.
Yeah, that's true. They'll have turned off. And we got a bit of backlash last time as well, when we had Vish coming on after the Ollie Robinson saga, and when we spoke about January 26th back at the start of the year. That prompted some backlash as well. And look, that's fine. People are entitled to their opinions, but we're going to keep making shows like this because we think it's important, and we're going to have guests like Taha and Nikesh on to tell their stories, because we want to use our platform for that. So again, thank you to them. Thanks for everyone for listening. Thank you to Brick Lane for their support of the show. To all of our patrons, patreon.com/the final word. If you are a patron, you'll receive a third discount on our live shows. Melbourne on the 13th of December at the Mission to Seafarers, and the 14th of December at Unibar in Adelaide. TBC, but coming up as well in Sydney on the 4th of January. This has been The Final Word. Adam Collins and Jeff Lemon. We'll be back with story time on the weekend. Bye for now.
See ya.